Hey everyone, this is Blake. Today I'm going to be going over weighing in LD. So this video is about weighing, but it could just as easily be called how to win LD debate because weighing is an incredibly important tool. Everybody kind of knows that they're supposed to do it, but not everybody knows how important it is to the judge and to winning rounds. So in this video, we'll go over how to structure weighing claims, how to strategically improve them, and just why they're so important. So the thing about weighing is that the uh, role of weighing claims is to tell the judge what impact matters more than other impacts. So when we're talking about LD rounds that have between the AF and the neg 4 or 5 flows or 6 or 7 contentions or something like that, it's really important that the judge doesn't have to look at all 6 or 7 of those areas and then kind of allocate points and figure out some arbitrary way to decide which contention to vote on, but rather the debaters should be telling the judge by the end of the round, we had the discussion on all 7 of these flows. These are the 2 that you're going to look at to make your decision on, or this is the one that is going to decide which way you vote. So the best way to kind of develop an appreciation for how important weighing is to put yourself in the position of a judge and think about if you were making a decision for the round that is happening, how difficult it would be based on however many different impacts are floating out in the ether of the debate. So to start, we're going to talk about structuring our weighing claims. Weighing is something that everybody kind of just estimates how they should do it. There's not a lot of places where people will give you a hard set structure for how to make weighing claims, but structuring these claims properly and consistently is really important. So this structure is a way that I use just to keep track to make sure that all of the necessary parts of weighing are included and that it's in a way that the judge can understand. So this structure is something that helped me a lot when I was debating and helps a lot as helps some of the other debaters that I've worked with come up with how to properly make weighing claims. So there's 5 steps here. The 5th one is a little bit unique, but we'll talk about that in detail later on. But the steps are to name a mechanism, contextualize your impact, undercut your opponent's impact, talk about the ballot, and then do meta weighing. So we're going to talk about all of these things in greater detail and give you some advice on how to do these things effectively. So naming your mechanism is the easiest part to actually do in the speech, but it's a difficult one strategically to figure out what the best route to take is. So really, to name your mechanism, all you have to do is say, our impact outweighs on whatever. And that blank, that whatever, is going to be filled in with any number of these weighing mechanisms that are used in LD. So I have listed here just 5 examples. These are the 5 that I think come up the most. There are some others out there, or if you hear others, don't be surprised. Just like with standards for theory or voters or anything like of that nature, people will come up with as many as they need to effectively explain the concept that they're discussing. So, but the 5 that we're going to talk about are the 5 that I think are most common. So what we mean when we say mechanism is it's a way of comparing 2 different impacts. A mechanism is the thing that tells us what aspect of the impacts we're considering. So for instance, the first example here is probability. So if we're comparing our impacts based on probability, we're going to be taking into account which one is more likely to happen. So the example I have here is structural violence versus nuclear war. So structural violence is dealing with things like discrimination, oppression, and systemic violence, whereas nuclear war would be an all-out, all-at-once international conflict. So when we're doing our probability weighing, we are probably going to be leaning more heavily on structural violence here, saying that structural violence is far more likely to happen than nuclear war because we see it already happening in the status quo. It's not a very far stretch of the imagination to imagine that it's going to increase or happen more, whereas nuclear war has never happened before, so chances are it's not just going to happen all of a sudden out of the blue. The probability for structural violence is much higher than nuclear war. So if we're dealing with that kind of debate and we're on the side of structural violence, probability is a good one to go with. But then this next one is magnitude. So magnitude is the severity of the impact, how severe or how strong the effect is on individuals. So the example here is structural violence versus material violence. This is one that is less clear than the probability example that I gave. It's one that is an ongoing discussion that you'll hear either side be taken in debate. But some of the arguments for each, some people would say structural violence is worse than material violence because it is dehumanizing, it decreases quality of life, and then often justifies material violence in the long run. Where as people arguing for material violence would say the magnitude of being actually killed or mistreated or having violence inflicted upon you would be far worse than just being discriminated against or something like that, because those are literal physical threats to your health and safety. So that is an ongoing discussion, but magnitude, the important thing to understand in this example is that the difference that we're talking about is of magnitude, what the quality of life or what the experience is for one person that encounters this. So the next example here is time frame. Time frame is how long it will take for this impact to occur. So for example, if we're talking about global warming versus nuclear war, global warming is something that will not occur instantly. It takes several years for the global climate to change. Now, granted, the actual warranting of a specific contention or something like that could accelerate that time frame, could say that, by the end of 2025, things will be past the point of no return. But nuclear war is something that can happen instantaneously with the push of a single button where one country launches their nuclear weapons. By the end of probably about an hour, all sorts of nuclear weapons all over the world will have launched and landed and resulted in all sorts of negative impacts. So when it comes to time frame, nuclear war is something that is more likely to happen, but you can just as easily say that the opposite is true, because nuclear war, nobody pushes those buttons until tension has increased for a long enough time. So you could also say that the time frame for nuclear war is extremely long because we need time for international tensions to escalate to the point of where a nuclear war would occur, whereas global warming is already happening. It's kind of a runaway train, and that we don't need to wait for any international event for that to occur. So again, these impact debates can go either way, but that's an example of what time frame application looks like. Reversibility is an interesting example. It's exactly what it sounds like. How possible is it to say that we can just undo the impact that is described? So for nuclear war versus economic collapse, nuclear war is something that is, of course, not reversible. If we decimate most of the population of the entire world, if we destroy entire nations and things like that, we can't just rebuild them or bring those people back to life. Whereas something like economic collapse is reversible because of the break-bust cycle of the U.S. economy, job growth and expansion that comes after long periods of depression. There are a lot of justifications why economic collapse is something that we could probably bounce back from because we've done it before. So in the case of reversibility, nuclear war is definitely coming out on top in that discussion. So the last thing I have listed here is scope. Scope is how many entities are being affected by the impact. So the example I have here is conventional war versus global warming. What I mean by conventional war is kind of like the troops on the ground type image that comes to mind when we talk about wars as opposed to nuclear wars. So when we're having the scope debate here, we're probably going to come out saying that global warming will affect every single living thing on Earth. Global warming affects the entire planet, not just localized regions, so that's going to outweigh on scope. Whereas conventional war will only affect the involved countries and whatever countries become a battleground for that war. But you could also make the claim that conventional war at this stage of interconnectivity and globalization would bring in every single nation and probably result in an equally widespread impact that would meet the same as global warming on scope. So these are all just examples of some of the mechanisms that are out there. Hopefully this kind of helped you understand why you might pick one mechanism over the other, what all these mechanisms mean. Now, keep in mind that this is just the first step, and all your job is to say our impact outweighs on blank. You don't have to do any of the explanation in this first step, like I was doing with the examples. That was just to help you all understand, but we're going to talk about what that explanation looks like and how to structure that next. So the next step in making a weighing claim after you've named the mechanism that you're going with is to contextualize your impact. So you're going to explain why your impact is such a big deal. This is basically why you picked the mechanism you did, why scope is such a big uh, deal when we're talking about global warming, or why probability is so obviously the mechanism you want to pick when you're talking about structural violence or something like that. A lot of times people will be using alarmist and absolute language. What I mean by that is that they're going to be talking about worst case scenario and assuming that that is true. An effective weighing claim does not use qualifiers. You're not going to be persuading anybody if you get up there and you're like, chances are that a nuclear war would probably affect everybody because it's a pretty big deal and everybody would be involved because all these nations would be launching at each other. That's much less persuasive than to say nuclear war would mean the total decimation of the human race and all other life forms on the planet. So obviously using the more absolute language and the more hard-hitting descriptions is going to be more persuasive to the judge. And then the last note here is that this should be a time to appeal to pathos. So if you remember from your English class or whatever class may have taught you this, there's 3 basic types of appeals: pathos, logos, and ethos. Pathos being appeals to emotion, logos being appeal to logic, and ethos being appeal to credibility. So I'm saying here you should be using appeals to pathos, appeals to emotion, because you're talking about how terrible this would be, and you should be making the judge think about how worst case scenario this impact is. So appealing to that kind of sense of humanity and that kind of sense of urgency, and getting the judge to think, oh, we really do need to fix this, this is a big deal. Pathos is probably going to be the best route to get that response from your judge. So the next step in the explanation part is to undercut your opponent's impact. So basically this is just doing the opposite of what you just did for your own impact. So now you're going to be talking about why the mechanism you picked proves that the other impact barely matters at all. You're going to be talking about why probability totally destroys the idea that nuclear war is important. And this is where you're going to want to use things like qualifiers and rationalization. You're going to be wanting to over-rely on these qualifiers and these more reasonable thinking as opposed to this worst case scenario thinking you're doing for your own impact. So this is where you're going to want to talk more like, if nuclear war were to happen, which is extremely low in the first place, chances are other nations wouldn't even be involved. They're over-relying on the concept of global entanglement and ignoring the pre-existing barriers like mutually assured destruction that would ensure that there is almost a 0% chance that a nuclear weapon is ever launched. So you're talking much more rationally and less emotionally, which is why this last bullet point is saying that you should probably be appealing to logos here more so, talking about let's take the logical approach, let's look at this practically, and realize that this is much less severe than they're talking about. And remember that we are still impacting back to that mechanism that we gave. That's really important for both when you're building up your own impact and criticizing your opponents. It's really important that you are talking about the mechanism you picked, otherwise the judge can easily get lost in that analysis. If you say that you outweigh on magnitude and then you're talking about probability, the judge is going to have a hard time resolving that contradiction in their head, and it's going to be hard to even evaluate your weighing claim. So the fourth and kind of last step of making a weighing claim in a vacuum is to talk about the ballot. So this is when you speak directly to the judge about evaluating the round. I don't mean you should be like using their name or call them out specifically, but just imagine that you are speaking directly to somebody that has to make a decision right now, and you're going to tie everything back to framework. So for instance, if the standard is minimizing structural violence, you're going to want to say like, so if we are really trying to take the action that best minimizes structural violence, it's obvious that we need to be evaluating X before Y. So you're going to want to really emphasize that if that framework matters, if we are making a decision, you're going to have to look at the impact that I'm defending first. And another thing that is useful that you can do in this section is to talk about which parts of the flow we can ignore if this weighing claim is true. So if nuclear war matters more than any other impact in the round, then we don't even have to look at the negatives, second and third disad. We don't even have to look to my first contention. We're all going to be resolving this debate on the second contention of the AF, or something along those lines. So talking about the ballot is one of the easier steps because it's something that you can carry from round to round. There's not a ton of modification that you have to do. You just have to make sure that you're talking about the framework in the round, the right mechanism and the right plugging the right impacts in wherever you're talking about which ones we're emphasizing, which ones we're de-emphasizing. Otherwise, you can kind of follow that template of being like anyone who cares about X framework needs to look to X impact before Y impact because blah, blah, blah. So this part is relatively easy to say, relatively easy to go over, but it's hugely important. This is the part where weighing goes from being an important tool to the way that you win rounds, is when you are making it clear to the judge that this is the thing that you are deciding the round off of. Weighing is a huge tool that can tip the scales in your favor if you just tell the judge to look at the right flow first. So now we're going to talk about this fifth step that I had listed that I said was a little bit different. So this fifth step is meta weighing. It's kind of its own thing. There's its own structure, its own way that we're going to make these claims and things like that. But it is important to do it whenever there are multiple weighing claims on the flow. So I said that those first four steps kind of make up a normal weighing claim. So if you're making the first weighing claim of the round, you're probably going to stop there. But if there are multiple weighing claims, if there's multiple weighing mechanisms that are being discussed, you're going to want to go to this fifth step and do some meta weighing. So meta weighing is weighing between mechanisms. So the term meta means referring to oneself. So we are weighing between weighing claims. So we're going to explain why the mechanism that you are talking about matters more than other mechanisms that you think your opponent could talk about or that your opponent already has talked about. So if you're doing the nuclear war versus structural violence debate, chances are that if you're defending structural violence, you're going to be defending probability, then you can expect the person that went for nuclear war is going to go for either scope or magnitude. So you can kind of predict what your opponent's going to go for and use meta weighing to preemptively get ahead of those possible claims. It's always strategic. It's always a good idea to do it. But it is something where you can still win the round if you don't do it. Whereas weighing is an absolute necessity to win the round, meta weighing is just another strategic thing to tip the scales in your favor. So here's the structure that I recommend for meta weighing. You're going to just say what mechanism outweighs what, so probability outweighs scope or whatever, and then you're going to talk about why your mechanism is important and then undercut your opponent's mechanism. So if that sounds familiar, it's because it's basically the first three steps of making regular weighing claims, but there's less of a need to talk about the ballot because this is more so telling the judge how to weigh between weighing claims, and the weighing claims tell them how to think about the ballot. So the ballot is already implicitly involved in this without you having to bring it up again. And then obviously there's no step 5 because meta weighing is the step 5. So the last point I have here is avoid contradictions elsewhere on the flow. So for instance, if on your first AF contention you were saying that probability outweighs scope, and then you go on to the negative disad and you say probability actually isn't as important as magnitude, then all of a sudden you've made all of the work you did on probability on the AF flow totally meaningless because the judge is just like, oh, okay, then I'll just look at magnitude because it's the most important mechanism in the round. So avoid contradicting yourself, but it's totally okay to use meta weighing as a way to get out of certain flows that you don't want to deal with. So for instance, if you think you might be behind on a certain disad, definitely take the time to try to answer it line by line, but you can also use weighing as being like, but even if you don't believe what I'm saying, you're not even looking at this flow because you're looking at this AF contingent because it outweighs on probability. So meta weighing is an important tool, but it's also something you want to be careful and cognizant of how you're contradicting yourself or other claims elsewhere on the flow. So if you're a little bit cloudy on what this meta weighing looks like, don't worry, there's going to be an example of it at the end. So before we get to those examples, though, I want to make some clarifications on all the stuff that I talked about. So I've used the terms your impact and your opponent's impact just to refer to like your impact being the one that you're defending. But that's a little bit of a misnomer. It's a little bit misleading. For instance, if you read an AF that is talking about structural violence and your opponent read a nuclear war disad, and you think you did a much more effective job turning that nuclear war disad than you did defending the structural violence AF, it's totally okay for you to go for the nuclear war outweighs. You don't necessarily always need to tell the judge that you're looking at the flow or the impact that you originally read. It's the one that you think you are winning on. So that's totally okay. But then The other point here is that when using extreme language, you want to maintain a clear connection to the evidence read about the impact. So, for instance, when you're using the type of absolute language that I was suggesting you do in step 2 about building up your own impact, it's really important that you're not just being dishonest. You need to be talking about it realistically and based on what the experts say. So there are absolutely experts out there, and there are articles and there are impact cards out there that will say that things are absolutely important, or that they're an absolute risk, or things like that. You need to be using that evidence to back up those claims. Don't be making those claims if they are disconnected from the evidence. And then evidence comparison is an extremely strong tool for weighing because, like I said, all of your defense of your own impact should be based on having a strong impact card. But if you can prove that your opponent's card is not solid evidence or something like that, all of a sudden you've invalidated a lot of their weighing claims. So evidence comparison is a really cool tool to kind of undercut weighing claims from other places in the flow that your opponent might not necessarily be expecting it. And then evidence comparison is also just a really important tool that you should get some practice on. We have a video on evidence comparison. I would suggest you watch it. And then any impact left untouched by weighing is much harder to ignore. So what I mean by that is that if you do this direct weighing between the impact of the first AF contention and one of the neg disads, but you're completely ignoring the second disad or something like that, the judge is going to have to kind of think about the second disad before they look anywhere else, unless you clearly telegraph to them. If your opponent clearly says, I'm kicking out of the second disad, or if you say the first contention not only overwhelms the first disad but also the second one, you should be making it extremely clear to the judge that these weighing claims apply to everything on the flow. Otherwise, the judge might wind up thinking, why did this second disad get completely disregarded, and wind up looking there because they're not sure how it fits into this weighing hierarchy, even though you really didn't want them to look at that flow. So it's really important that you're talking about all of these flows or all of the impacts in the round. Otherwise, the judge could wind up looking to one that you don't want them to look to. So now that we've done those clarifications, we're going to do some examples. So the first example is just what a whole weighing claim looks like. We're putting steps 1 through 5 all together. This is kind of a summation example of everything that we've talked about so far. So step 1 is to name a mechanism. So this is really straightforward. Structural violence outweighs nuclear war on probability. So we're just saying X outweighs Y based on mechanism. And then the second thing is to build up or defend your own impact. In this case, we're defending structural violence. So we're going to build that up. We're going to say structural violence is ongoing and can be seen everywhere in the status quo. So it is obvious that discriminatory practices will lead to an immediate decrease in quality of life for people everywhere. So while I didn't say probability directly, I'm very heavily implying probabilistic analysis when I'm saying it is everywhere already in the status quo. It's obvious that an immediate effect will occur, that it's really plain to see that this is something that is definitely going to happen. This could probably be improved by making a direct claim on probability, but it is clear that that is the type of analysis I'm doing. So now we're going to go to step 3. We're going to undercut the opposing impact. So we're going to say nuclear war has never happened in human history. There have been only 2 nuclear weapons ever used, and they were 2 of the first ever made. Now, because every global power has a nuclear arsenal, mutually assured destruction proves that nuclear war is about as likely as every nation agreeing to bomb themselves. So you can see that in this one, we're talking more directly about probability. I use the term about as likely to really hit on that probability idea. I'm talking much more rationally than I was talking about structural violence, much more literally. With structural violence, I was kind of talking about in the abstract, whereas with nuclear war, I'm like, let's look at the facts, let's look at the details. And then I'm closing it with this kind of comparison to this thing that very clearly won't happen, about every nation agreeing to bomb themselves, to kind of appeal to that logical side of the judge to be like, come on, really think about this practically, whereas with structural violence, I'm like, think about this emotionally. Okay, so the step 4 is to tie it back to the ballot and talk about framework. So I imagined for this round that the framework would be maximizing expected well-being. So I said, this means that if we are truly worried about maximizing expected well-being, we need to look to the impact that we can actually expect to happen, which is structural violence. So this could absolutely be longer. It could absolutely be fleshed out a little bit more. But what I did as kind of a shortcut, so I didn't have to stretch it out as much, is I use a direct language from the standard, from the framing mechanism. So the framing mechanism is maximizing expected well-being, and I kind of single out that word expect, that we should focus on impacts that we actually expect to happen, because maximizing expected well-being is an inherently probabilistic standard. It's a framework that inherently suggests that we should be looking to probability and considering things that are expected to happen. So I'm saying that if that framework really matters, then we should be looking at these impacts first. So then I also did some meta weighing here. Because we're talking about nuclear war, I kind of predicted that my opponent will probably talk about magnitude. So for the meta weighing, I said, additionally, probability matters more than magnitude. That's the step 1 of meta weighing. And then for the step 2 of meta weighing, I said, probability is the tool that allows humans to make decisions when faced with 2 bad options. It is literally programmed into human nature. So that's how I talk up probability. I'm talking more in the abstract as opposed to the specifics of debate, because we're doing a meta discussion as opposed to a direct discussion of the resolution. So then for step 3, to talk about why magnitude isn't as important, I said, in the absence of probability assessment, magnitude claims are just alarmist rhetoric that is used for manipulation. So I'm saying that magnitude on its own is not a tool that can be used for any decision making. We need probability. Probability matters more. So that's an example of what it looks like if we do all 5 steps, including meta weighing. Like with anything in debate, we could absolutely workshop this. We could absolutely improve it. So don't think of this as the end-all be-all, but think of it as an example to kind of get it clearer in your head so that you can get an idea of what these claims look like. So we're going to talk about something that is a bit of an exception to the structure, because it kind of changes the way that we frame weighing claims a little bit. So there is another really useful and really interesting mechanism that can be used for weighing that I personally think is particularly persuasive, and that mechanism is controlling the internal link. What I mean by that is that if one impact necessarily leads to another impact, or is the only thing that can cause another impact to occur, then that is probably the impact that we should look at first. So the example I have here is biodiversity versus global warming. This is one that can go either way. So we can say either the loss of biodiversity is the only thing that can allow global temperatures to pass a point that would lead to total extinction, or we could say the rising temperatures are the only thing that could decrease biodiversity in the planet so greatly that we are facing an extinction scenario. But either way, we are saying that one causes the other, and that means it's more important. So because causality claims cannot be made in a vacuum, all analysis needs to be comparative. What I mean by that is that we can't just say for step 2, like, oh, hey, biodiversity is really good for internal link and global warming is really bad for internal link for step 3. We need to do direct comparison between the two. So we should be talking about both in every step. So the way that I structure these claims, the way that I recommend structuring these claims is to, 1, say impact A controls the internal link to impact B. That's the part where you just say it. It's the claim that makes it really neat and easy to flow and easy to follow. 2nd, you explain the causality, why impact A leads to impact B. And then for step 3, you're going to talk about how going the other way doesn't make sense. We can't get from impact B to impact A. And then step 4 is just talk about the ballot again, because that's the part where you win the round. So that should be the same, and you're still talking about why this means you win. So let's look at an example for that one. So first, I'm saying international tension controls the internal link to nuclear war. So in this scenario, we had one flow talking about how the impact is international tension, and the other flow talking about how the impact is a nuclear war. I'm on the side of international tension, so I'm going to make the claim, and it's clear to the judge that I'm making a causality claim. So step 2 is I'm going to talk about that causality. The only reason that global leaders would be willing to initiate war on a nuclear scale would be a total upset of global order and cooperation. The international contention gives a clear picture of how that level of conflict would rise. So I'm making it clear that the only way that we could get to point B is by passing through point A. The only way that we can consider nuclear war is if we have a international tension impact, and you get that from my contention. So then the step 3 is I'm going to talk about how we can't go the other way. We can't see nuclear war causing international tension, or we can't go from the starting point of nuclear war existing without considering international tension. So I'm going to say, in the absence of the explanation given by the affirmative, nuclear war claims are senseless. Nowhere in the dissat is there an explanation of how we get from the status quo of international alliances to the point B of total warfare. So I'm saying it's a logical impossibility that if we take out the part A, if we take out the international tension impact, that we get to nuclear war. So I'm pointing out how impossible this causality is in the absence of the international tension impact. So I'm going to talk about the ballot. I'm going to say that this means the only way you can vote on nuclear war is by voting for the AF, because the neg cannot access that impact without fabricating new tension scenarios in the NR or conceding that AF tension claims are true. So I'm saying that if international tension is the only way that we get to nuclear war, then there's no way that nuclear war is going to happen in the negative, because the negative never tells us where tension rises. The AF is the only place that you can vote if you think nuclear war matters, because voting for the AF gives you a robust enough scenario to understand why tension rises to the point of nuclear war occurring. And then you'll also notice that there isn't meta-weighing here, and that's because meta-weighing with internal link claims is a little bit of a impossibility, because it's not directly something that has value in itself, like probability or scope or something like that. It's not something that really exists in a vacuum, which means that we can't do comparative weighing of it against other things in the abstract. We can only talk about internal links in concrete examples. We can't talk about it in the abstract, so we can say controlling the internal link matters more than probability, because in order to do that, we'd have to explain what the internal link looks like in the specific scenario described, in which case we're just making more weighing claims. It's self-defeating. So the key takeaways from this video, because we've talked about quite a bit, is that weighing is the key to accessing framework effectively. So if we are using our weighing mechanisms to impact back to the framework, that's the way that the judge can truly understand why our impacts matter under the framing provided. The weighing mechanism is the shortcut that helps the judge understand and contextualize the impacts of the framework. And the best tool to have for weighing claims is strong impact evidence, evidence that can back up the claims that you're making in your step 2 about how important it is. It's really good to have a strong piece of evidence backing you up. We want to remember the structure of weighing claims, to name the mechanism, contextualize your impact, undercut your opponent, talk about the ballot, and then do meta weighing. Remember those steps, and you'll always be making complete weighing claims if you follow that structure. And then remember that weighing to the ballot is where people win or lose rounds. If you forget to talk about the ballot in a weighing claim, it's pretty meaningless. You need to be really talking about the ballot and contextualizing it as to the judge's priorities and making it clear that this weighing claim is how the judge should decide the round. If you do that, you'll win, and if you don't do that, you'll lose. And it really is just about that simple, that weighing is the thing that is the number one reason why people lose rounds, is to fall behind on the weighing debate. So I would strongly suggest that you take this seriously and get lots of practice with this one. So that's all I have for this video, and thanks for watching.